Imagine waking up tomorrow. Nothing about you has changed. You're still the same person. You still love the same people. You still believe you know right from wrong. But today, someone gives you complete authority over another human being. No cameras, no laws, no consequences, just one instruction. You are in control. What would you do? Most people answer that question instantly. I'd never abuse that power. I'd never hurt someone. I know who I am. But what if you're wrong? What if the person you believe yourself to be only exists because you've never been tested? For decades, psychologists have asked one terrifying question. Can ordinary people become cruel simply because the situation allows it? The answer led to some of the most controversial experiments ever performed. Experiments so disturbing, they continue to divide scientists even today. And what they revealed might change the way you see yourself forever. When World War II finally ended, the world was left asking one impossible question. How could millions of ordinary people participate in unimaginable cruelty? Were they monsters? Or were they ordinary people placed inside extraordinary circumstances? Many wanted to believe the answer was simple. Only evil people commit evil acts. The rest of us would never do such things. But one young psychologist wasn't convinced. His name was Stanley Milgram, and he believed something much darker. Maybe obedience is stronger than morality. Maybe, under enough pressure, almost anyone could cross a line they never imagined crossing. There was only one way to find out. He needed volunteers. Not soldiers, not criminals, ordinary people, teachers, engineers, students, parents, people just like you. The experiment begins. In 1961, newspaper advertisements invited people to participate in a scientific study at Yale University. The study, they were told, was about memory. Nothing sounded unusual. Participants arrived expecting to spend an ordinary afternoon helping science. Instead, they unknowingly walked into one of the most famous psychological experiments ever conducted. Each volunteer met another participant, or so they thought. In reality, the other participant was an actor. The roles were assigned. One person became the teacher, the other became the learner. The learner was strapped into a chair. Electrodes were attached to his arms. The teacher watched everything. Then came the machine, a large panel filled with switches, 15 volts, 30 volts, 45, 60, 75. The numbers kept rising. Eventually, they reached 450 volts. Above the final switch, one warning appeared. Danger, severe shock. The teacher received one simple instruction. Every time the learner answers incorrectly, press the next switch. Increase the voltage. One mistake. One stronger shock. Simple, scientific, controlled. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Because the truth was, the machine wasn't connected to anything. No electricity would ever pass through it. The learner was perfectly safe. But the volunteers didn't know that. And very soon, everything changed. The first shock. The experiment began. The first answers were easy. The first mistakes were expected. The teacher pressed the first switch. 15 volts. Nothing happened. 30 volts. Still nothing. 45, 60, 75. The learner remained calm. Then, at 75 volts, everything changed. A voice came from the other room. Ah, a quiet sound of pain. The teacher looked toward the scientist. The scientist calmly nodded. Please continue. The teacher hesitated, but continued. 90 volts, 105, 120. The cries became louder. The learner begged for the experiment to stop. Some volunteers smiled nervously. Others laughed. Not because they enjoyed it, but because stress can make people laugh when they don't know what else to do. For the first time, many began asking the same question. Should I really keep going? And the answer they received was always the same. The experiment requires that you continue. The volunteers had reached their first moral crossroads. None of them knew that the hardest decision was still ahead. The shocks continued. 90 volts, 105, 120. Each time the teacher hesitated, the scientist repeated the same instruction. Please continue. At first, it felt like a simple task, a procedure, a sequence of steps. But something inside the room was changing. The learner's voice became less controlled, more desperate. Let me out. I don't want to continue. The teacher shifted in his chair, looked at the experimenter, then back at the machine. At 150 volts, the learner screamed. Not in words anymore, just raw sound, pain, fear, human reaction. Some teachers stopped. They turned to the scientist and said, "I can't do this." But the scientist did not argue. He did not threaten. He simply said, "The experiment requires that you continue." If they still refused, he added, "You have no other choice." What happened next shocked everyone. Some participants laughed nervously. Some sweated heavily. Some trembled uncontrollably. One man covered his face with his hands, but still pressed the next switch. 200 volts. The learner screamed to stop. 220. The voice weakened. 240. The learner no longer answered properly. And yet, many continued. Not because they were cruel, not because they wanted harm, but because someone in authority told them to continue. 300 volts. Silence between screams. 330. No more coherent responses, just pounding on the wall. 450 volts. The final switch. Marked in red. Danger, severe shock. The teacher's hand often hovered over it. Some refused, but many pressed it anyway. When the experiment ended, the results shocked even the researchers. Before the study, psychologists predicted that only a tiny fraction of people would obey. Experts guessed maybe 1 or 2%. But reality was different, much different. Around 2/3 of participants continued to the highest level, to the very end, even when they believed they might be killing someone. The question that followed was simple. What kind of people were they? Monsters? Or something else entirely? Milgram argued something controversial. He said the problem was not personality. It was situation, authority, distance, pressure, and the slow erosion of personal responsibility. But decades later, his experiment would face criticism. Serious criticism. Because if ordinary people can obey authority, what happens when authority is combined with power itself? Not just orders, but control over other human beings. No instructions, no structure, only freedom and dominance. To explore that question, another experiment would be conducted. This time at a university in California, in a basement, where students were randomly divided into guards and prisoners. And what happened there would become even more controversial than Milgram's study. This was the Stanford prison experiment. After Milgram, another experiment would push the question even further. Not obedience to authority, but something more primal, power itself. In 1971, at Stanford University, psychologist Philip Zimbardo set up a simulated prison. In the basement, cold walls, concrete floors, metal doors. Students were randomly assigned roles, prisoners and guards. No training, no preparation, just instructions. Maintain order, nothing more. At first, it looked like a game. Guards wore uniforms, dark sunglasses, wooden batons. Prisoners were given numbers instead of names. Prisoner 8612, Prisoner 819. The first day was quiet, almost boring, but power does not stay still. By the second day, something changed. A small rebellion, a refusal, a challenge to authority. The guards responded, not with instructions, but with force. Stop talking! Silence. Rules began to appear. Push-ups as punishment, loss of privileges, isolation, sleep disruption. The environment started to feel real, too real. Prisoners began breaking down. Some refused to eat. Some cried uncontrollably. One began screams. Not for attention, but because he could no longer distinguish reality from simulation. Some guards remained neutral. Others became creative. Not because they were told to, but because they could. They invented punishments. They enforced silence. They enjoyed control. Within days, the experiment spiraled beyond control. The psychological effects became severe. Zimbardo himself began to lose perspective. He was no longer just a researcher. He was acting like a prison superintendent. The experiment was planned to last 2 weeks. It ended in 6 days, because the situation had become too intense, too unstable, too real. The Stanford prison experiment became one of the most famous psychology studies in history, a symbol of how power can corrupt. But decades later, scientists began asking uncomfortable questions. Was it really a pure psychological experiment? Or had the situation been shaped by expectations, by instructions, by performance? Critics argued that some guards may have been influenced to behave more aggressively than they naturally would. Others pointed out that results were less consistent than originally reported. Today, many psychologists agree on something more complex. The Stanford prison experiment was not simple proof that power automatically creates cruelty. It revealed something more subtle. Power amplifies existing tendencies, but it also depends on context, identity, and group behavior. So if Milgram showed obedience and Stanford showed power, the question becomes even darker. What happens when authority is not imposed, but shared? When people are not forced, but influenced by group identity? To understand that, researchers ran another experiment, one that would challenge both Milgram and Stanford. This was the BBC prison study, and it told a very different story. After Milgram, after Stanford, one question remained unresolved. What if the results were not universal? What if human behavior was not fixed by authority alone? In 2001, two psychologists, Alex Haslam and Stephen Riker, decided to repeat the prison experiment, but they changed the foundation of the study. They did not assume people would become cruel. They did not expect obedience. Instead, they focused on something else: identity, group behavior, and choice. The experiment took place in a controlled environment, similar to Stanford. Participants were randomly assigned as guards and prisoners. At first, everything seemed familiar: structured roles, a controlled setting, the expectation of hierarchy. But what happened next was not what previous experiments suggested. Something important did not occur. The guards did not naturally become oppressive. There was no automatic shift into cruelty. Many participants resisted acting like authority figures at all. They were unsure, uncomfortable with control, unwilling to enforce strict dominance. And slowly, the entire dynamic began to change, because something else started forming. The prisoners began to organize, not as individuals, but as a group. A shared identity emerged. They began to see themselves not just as prisoners, but as us. And that changed everything. A leader appeared among them, not assigned, not forced, chosen by the group itself. And with that, the balance of power shifted. The prisoners began to negotiate, to resist, to challenge authority not as isolated individuals, but as a unified force. The guards, in contrast, struggled to maintain control, not because they lacked strength, but because their authority was no longer accepted. Power only exists when it is recognized, and in this case, it was no longer recognized. The system began to collapse from within, not through violence, but through rejection, through identity, and through collective decision. The experiment reached a conclusion very different from Stanford. It showed that power does not automatically corrupt. It depends on whether people accept the role they are placed in and whether they identify with it. After decades of research, 3 major experiments stood side by side. Milgram showed obedience to authority. Stanford suggested that power and roles could push people toward cruelty. But the BBC prison study challenged both conclusions. It showed something more complex. Human behavior is not automatic. It is not predetermined. It is shaped by context, by identity, by belonging, and by resistance. There is no single switch inside the human mind that turns good people into bad ones. Instead, there are pressures, situations, systems, and interpretations of those systems. People do not simply obey. They also question. They resist. They adapt. We like to believe that evil is something distant, something separate from us, something extreme. But psychology suggests something more uncomfortable. Under the right conditions, ordinary people can behave in ways they never expected. Not because they are monsters, but because situations can shape decisions more than personality alone. And this leads to a question that has no easy answer. Not what did they do, but what would you do if you were placed in the same situation? Because the most unsettling discovery of all is not that humans can obey or that humans can dominate. It is that none of us can be entirely sure how we would behave until we are tested.